What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the third person and action RPG tutorial series, we're going to be going over rolling and dodging part 2. In this part of the rolling and dodging, we are going to be using root motion to move our character, so it will move with the roll quite nicely. It'll be a pretty smooth transition from walking or idle into the roll, and it will actually move the character instead of snapping or applying forces and things like that. So our roll will always be consistent. Now we can roll off of surfaces as well, and you see we don't go really far. We'll go the same distance as we would if we were standing on the ground the whole time. So I'm very excited about this. You'll also notice that a lot of the animations are different than what we had before. So you'll see that I have different walking animations as well as different equip animations. And this is because I have organized all my animations, got some different animations for my new skeleton that I'm using for the Mixamo skeleton that supports root motion. So it's perfectly normal to see a few things that are different here, and I'll go over and show you what I have for everything. That way you know what it is if you see it in the future and what it represents for your game when you're following these episodes. Now before we hop into this episode, if you want to get caught up in the series, I recommend you check out this entire playlist right here. You can see how we've done everything to this point, from the equipping items, attacking opponents, and all that good stuff. If you're only interested in today's episode, the rolling and dodging, I recommend that you watch this episode right here, which is the first episode of rolling and dodging. We're still going to be using that same system. We're just going to change a few little things to change it from forces to root motion when pressing our input. That way our animation controls where we go, not forces in the game. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. Now this is a code and blueprint tutorial series, but everything today is going to be in the editor and in the blueprints. We don't have anything to change in the code because we're mainly going to be setting up a skeleton that supports root motion. And after that, we are going to deal with all the changes that come with that. So first things first, we need a skeleton that supports root motion. Your skeleton may already do this. If you're following the series and you have your own custom character or a custom skeleton that you created or that you grabbed from a marketplace, that shouldn't be an issue. But if you are using the Mixamo skeleton, like I am, this is a character from Mixamo, then you actually won't be able to support root motion by default. So you can't move the character when the animation that a character plays has movement in it. So there's an easy way to change that, and I already have a video on that is the same for all my series. So I used it in my fighter. I'm going to link it to you right now. It's a generic one. You can see how to set up your Mixamo skeleton to use root motion. So it's in that top right corner, and I'll also link it in the description so you can go ahead and check it out that way if you want. Now once you followed that tutorial, or if you have a skeleton that supports root motion already, we're ready to go to the next step. The next step is making sure that the character we have can actually use root motion, so our skeleton can now. But there's a few things we need to do in the character blueprint and in the animation blueprints to actually set that up so that we can use that new skeleton. First things first, I want to show you my new skeleton. So if you had followed that episode I linked, or if you want to check to see if your skeleton supports root motion, you can go to your skeleton, which for me is character root motion _ skeleton. In here, you can see all the bones that make up your skeleton, and I have a mesh on it, which is my assassin, but that doesn't matter. All you need to see is the bone hierarchy. There's going to be a top bone here called root. The root bone is where the root motion comes from, and we need this root bone here to actually be able to transform the character when they perform an animation, such as the roll that would actually move them. Now, I haven't deleted the other skeleton that I had, the original, so that's my Knight D. Pellegrini skeleton. Let's go into that one. You'll see that they are different. Long story short, root motion can't work with the regular Mixamo skeleton without modifying it in some way. Whereas if we have the skeleton with the root bone here, you'll know that we have the ability to perform root motion on our character. And that's what we're going to need for today's episode. So once you verify that you have that, we can now go and look at all the animations I've added for my root motion. I put them in a new folder called Root Motion Upgrade. And I have the same setup as before. Some of the animations are different than what I had before because I just grabbed them off Mixamo. But I will quickly go through them. So I have my axe animations. Then my blend space for my axe. Of course, we have the same rules as the other blend spaces I've set up in the past, just using these new animations. You can pause at any point while I'm going through these if you want to mirror or mimic what you see here. Here is my roll and dodge animation. This one we'll come back to. And the T-pose. So that should be everything. You should be able to see every value in here for all my animations and all my blend spaces. Now at this point, you see these are my new animations, my new skeleton, everything's good to go. Before we get into actually implementing this, let's go to our roll and dodge that I mentioned earlier. So this is the animation I want to use for my roll and my dodge. Now, previously in the series, in the previous episode even, we had this animation applying in place. And what that means is when it plays, the character does not try to move. It plays in place. We were manually adding forces, which was adding movement to the character. However, now we want the animation itself to control the movement on the character. And to do that, we want to enable root motion. So here's my animation. And I can scroll down to the root motion section here and check enable root motion. By default, these are all false, and you'll see if it's false, you'll actually see movement in the world. That's because the character is moving, and then they will snap back to this position at the end of the animation. When you enable root motion, the character is moving with the animation, and so it'll look very natural, very smooth. So pressing enable root motion on the animations we want to enable root motion on, such as our roll, is all we need to do on the animations themselves. That's good for this episode, but we need to go into the animation blueprint and make sure everything works with our new skeleton. So this is my assassin AnimBP. This is the same AnimBP that I have used for all the episodes in the series so far. I am going to copy this behavior and move it over to another animation blueprint. Or at least that's what you'll want to do if you're in Unreal Engine 4. And so I've gone ahead and done that anyway, because I want all my tutorials to work between Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5 unless specifically stated otherwise. So if you're in Unreal Engine 4, just make a new AnimBP. I can even go through the process with you. So blueprints, AnimBP, add, animation, animation blueprint. Then select your new skeleton, your root motion skeleton, and hit create. That's what I've done to get this Assassin Root Motion, or Assassin RM AnimBP. Then I went into this AnimBP, and I went to the state machine of each of them, and copied all the behavior, and pasted it. You'll also want to go into your anim graph of the original AnimBP, and make sure you set up your default state machine. So go into the anim graph of your new one, and state machine. And then you can create a state machine, and here you can just drag it into the result. Then lastly, you'll want to go to your event graph and copy everything from the event graph here over to your new one. And you can literally copy and paste that. You'll want to make sure you have all the variables, so you can press plus variable to add every single one that you had in the old AnimBP over to the new one. Or you can actually right-click on the variable, copy it, and then go to your new AnimBP, right-click in the variable section and paste variable, and that will work as well. Now that is all for Unreal Engine 4. That's what we did for the other series, that's what we've done to date. However, Unreal Engine 5 does have the ability to change the target skeleton, and so with that, you don't have to create the new AnimBP and copy everything over like you just watched me do. Now, once you have everything copied over, you can go into your state machine, and you will have to replace every single state with your new animation. This is all the same behavior as before, literally every single one. The only difference is I am using the new root motion animations that work with this skeleton, instead of the original animations we were using for each of these states. That goes for the blend spaces as well. So there you go. You see I even have my special transitions and states for my blueprint only input buffer series in here. Those ones of course are not required, but every single thing I've done this series now supports root motion, and that's exactly what we want. Now, this is good for Unreal Engine 4, and it works in Unreal Engine 5 as well. However, if you are in Unreal Engine 5, class settings in the animation blueprint, and click on Advanced under class options, and try and change the target skeleton. You can change it to your root motion skeleton. If you do this, it will actually let you use that new skeleton in your animation blueprint, but you will have to go in and change all your animations over. So this is a really, really nice feature in Unreal Engine 5, being able to change the skeleton in an animation blueprint instead of copying it and replacing all the logic every single time. With this method, all you have to change is your animations. However, if you do change the skeleton, make sure that your character blueprint is going to reflect and be able to use that skeleton as well. We'll get into that in a minute, but just be aware there are some changes you have to make with both methods. This one's just a little bit quicker because you don't have to make a new AnimBP and copy the variables and the event graph logic. You only have to deal with the state machine. Now, since I went through the hassle of copying everything over to the other animation blueprint so that it works in Unreal Engine 4 as well as Unreal Engine 5, I am going to use this one, so I'm actually going to reset my old AnimBP back to the original skeleton, and then all will be well with the world. At this point, I'm going to close my old skeleton. At this point, I have my root motion animation blueprint open and my base character BP. So let's go into the base character blueprint. You're going to need to do this no matter what method you used to change your skeleton over in your animation blueprint. If you're looking at the component list in your character BP, you should have a mesh somewhere. And that mesh is going to be your skeletal mesh or your character mesh. In here, you have two things that you need to look out for. So the first one is the animation class that you're using, or your anim class for your animation blueprint, and the skeletal mesh that you're using. So previously, I was using Knight D Pellegrini. Now, regardless of what method I used, if I want to use the root motion skeleton, this skeleton doesn't support root motion. They're not the same. So I don't want to use this skeletal mesh anymore. I want to use my new one, which is character root motion. When you change the skeletal mesh, it will automatically change your animation section to have no anim class. And so at this point, you want to select the new one that you made, Assassin Root Motion AnimBP, or if you changed over your skeleton in your animation blueprint and you only have one, just reselect that one that you are already using. You'll know you've done it correctly because the character is going to start animating. This is my idle pose, but you can see he is breathing, he's doing his idle animation. And so the skeleton we're using in the character blueprint matches what's in the animation blueprint, and that's what we want. You don't actually have to do anything in the base character BP at this point, just as long as the right animation blueprint is linked up and the right skeletal mesh is being used, you are good to go. So I'm going to close my base character BP at this point, and let's go back to the animation blueprint we're using. Let's go to the class defaults in here. So in the class defaults, we have something called root motion, and under here is root motion mode. By default, it is set to root motion from montages only because that is suitable for network multiplayer setups. Basically, you can use this root motion in online games. Right now, especially with me using just the Mixamo animations, I'm just importing them all in the regular animations. I still want the root motion to be applied from those animations, so I'm going to change this setting to root motion from everything. Now, once you have everything transferred over to the right settings, you can go into your game and play it. At this point, you should be able to do something like your roll, which has root motion, and the character should move with the animation. When the animation finishes, the character should remain in the spot that they ended up from the previous animation. In other words, if I roll, I don't want to snap back to where I started the roll. I want the character to be standing where the roll ended. Now, as far as the rolling goes, it should look pretty good at this point. But you might see a little bit of your jump animation start to play at the beginning, because in my case, the root motion does technically take the character up off the ground, and so when it's doing that, they kind of go into a jumping state, and we don't want that. We want the jump to be ignored if we're rolling or if we're doing an animation that has root motion that may pick them up off the ground. There's a few simple solutions. One is to make the jumping state an actual state instead of using the is-in-error boolean that we're using right now. We just haven't gotten around to updating that because we haven't needed it yet, but this would be a good example of when we could do that. Since we have a movement state enum variable on our character reference, if we added a jump, we could just check to see if the movement state was jumping. We wouldn't have to use this is in error, and then the character would never go into the jumping animation when rolling. But I believe that deserves its own episode, and so a very, very simple solution for now is to go to the idle to jump transition rule. And instead of just using is an error, I'm going to add a new condition. I'm going to grab my character reference, which is the owner of the animation blueprint, or essentially that character BP that we just saw earlier. I'm going to drag off of it and get my movement state. And we want to make sure it's not equal enum, the rolling state. The idle, the walking, the running, and other right now aren't going to lift the character into the air, so is an error. It's not going to be true for any reason during those states, but for rolling, it can be. So we want to make sure we're not in rolling. Then we want to say is an error and bool, and pass in the not equal to value, and pass that into the result. So that's what you see here. That little update will make it so we're not in the rolling state. Then we can go into the jumping animation when we're falling. This is useful because we may want to be in that animation without actually jumping, so I can enter that animation from pressing the jump button. But I can also enter that animation from just falling off of this platform without actually jumping. So now you have the best of both worlds. You can have the jump and the fall playing that animation, but the roll doesn't play a little jump animation beforehand and have to transfer out the roll dodge. It makes it look a little bit ugly, and it can throw your root motion off a little bit because the jump animation itself could have root motion, or you could have forces applied to that. There is one more thing we should cover with rolling and dodging, and that is directional rolling and dodging, because right now we can only dodge the direction we are looking. So that's what we'll cover next in our dodging and rolling episode. However, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it helped you implement root motion in your third-person action RPG tutorial series and improve your dodges and rolls. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. If you're interested in supporting myself or the series, you can check out the Patreon, YouTube membership, and Discord subscriptions like so many kind souls have. You guys are awesome, and you really keep this series alive, so thank you so much for all the love and support. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out with any problems that you had. Like I said, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.